infections, and lack of medical knowledge meant that even being born healthy offered no guarantee of life. Mothers, often young themselves, faced dangerous pregnancies, leaving newborns vulnerable. Even when babies survived birth, their bodies were fragile, and the environment offered no protection. Crowded homes, unclean floors, and exposure to waste and animals created a constant threat. Small injuries or infections could become fatal in a matter of days. Feeding was a challenge. Breastfeeding, while natural, was not always reliable. Mothers recovering from childbirth, malnourished or ill, sometimes could not produce enough milk. Wet nurses were rare and often expensive. Alternative feeding methods, gruel, watered milk, or bread, were nutritionally inadequate and carried risk of infection. Infants were vulnerable to intestinal parasites, dysentery, and other gastrointestinal diseases that sapped strength and caused early death. Even seemingly minor illnesses could rapidly escalate. From the age of 3 or 4, children were expected to contribute to survival. They carried water from wells, gathered firewood, and tended to small animals. They learned quickly that life demanded action, not rest. Work was not light or occasional, it was constant. Small bodies bent under heavy loads, ran errands across dangerous terrain, and faced exposure to weather, animal bites, and injury. The lessons of survival were learned early and harshly. Education for most children was practical rather than farming. Boys learned trades or farming. Girls learned domestic labor and fieldwork. These lessons were not optional. Knowledge was tied directly to survival and social expectation. The tools of work, hoes, spades, scythes, hammers, were heavy, sharp, and unforgiving. Mistakes led to injury, sometimes permanent. Children adapted quickly, learning not only technique but also resilience in the face of pain and fatigue. Nutrition during childhood was precarious. Meals were simple and repetitive. Bread, porridge, and occasional vegetables or meat formed the staple diet. Seasonal scarcity meant periods of hunger were normal. Children experienced malnutrition, leading to stunted growth, weak bones, and reduced immunity. When illness struck, malnourished bodies could not fight back. Repeated bouts of disease in childhood often determined whether someone would survive into adulthood. Disease was omnipresent. Children were exposed to smallpox, measles, respiratory infections, parasites, and other contagious illnesses. In crowded homes and villages, exposure was constant, infections spread quickly, and without effective medicine, recovery was uncertain. Some children survived due to strong constitution, others succumbed quietly, leaving their families to mourn without the ability to prevent loss. Childhood disease not only killed but left lasting effects on those who survived. Weakened bodies, chronic illness, and stunted growth were common. Violence and accidents were everyday threats. Children were not shielded from the dangers adults faced. Roads were unsafe. Tools were sharp, animals were unpredictable, and weapons were present even in households. Falls, cuts, burns, and crush injuries were common. Without proper care, even minor wounds could become infected, leading to chronic disability or death. The constant risk created an environment where fear and caution were learned early, shaping mental resilience but also anxiety that persisted into adulthood. Childhood labor was physically transformative. Muscles developed under stress, but joints, spines, and bones were often damaged irreparably. Stooping, lifting, and repetitive motions during critical growth periods caused long-term deformities. By adolescence, many children already showed the wear and tear that would limit mobility and endurance in adult life. Fatigue was constant. Play was rare, reserved only for brief moments when labor was done. Even then, the environment was never entirely safe. Education and skill acquisition were also survival strategies. Boys learned to farm, herd animals, hunt, or handle weapons. Girls learned cooking, cleaning, weaving, and childcare. Mastery of these skills could mean the difference between life and death. Mistakes could be fatal. Yet these lessons gave children agency. Knowledge became power, and skill became survival. However, Acquiring this knowledge required exposure to harsh realities, physical strain, accidents, and observation of death. Psychological strain was constant. Children witnessed siblings, friends, or neighbors die from disease, starvation, or accident. Violence was seen firsthand. Not as distant stories but as immediate reality. Mourning was commonplace. Fear, grief, and uncertainty shaped their minds as much as labor shaped their bodies. Mental resilience became a requirement for survival. Stress hormones ran high, weakening immune systems and contributing to early aging, even before adulthood. Nutrition, disease, labor, and mental stress intersected in dangerous ways. Malnourished children were more susceptible to infection. Fatigue increased the risk of accidents. Psychological strain weakened resilience to both illness and injury. Survival was never guaranteed. Each day carried threats that could end life or permanently compromise health. Those who survived did so to strength, constitution, and sometimes, luck. By the time children reached adolescence, the cumulative effects of labor, malnutrition, and disease had already shaped their bodies dramatically. Joints stiffened. Spines curved, and energy reserves were depleted. Adolescents entered adulthood hardened, resilient, but physically compromised. Only a small proportion of children would survive into their 30s and 40s, carrying with them the early scars of their formative years. Childhood in the Middle Ages was a continuous negotiation with mortality. The body was trained to endure, the mind to fear, and habits were forged to survive. Every injury, illness, or hardship was a teacher. Some children learned early, adapted, and survived. Others succumbed quietly, never reaching the age of 40. The childhood environment, a mixture of labor, danger, disease, and deprivation, set the stage for the fragile, shortened lives that were typical of medieval existence. The harshness of early life shaped expectations. Families did not assume that children would survive. Preparation for death was as practical as preparation for labor. Emotional resilience was a necessity, not a luxury. Those who reached adulthood carried the burden of early childhood experience, weakened bodies, scars, chronic illness, and mental strain. These early years determined, more than any other factor, the likelihood of reaching middle age. In sum, childhood in the Middle Ages was the crucible in which life expectancy was decided. The combination of labor, disease, malnutrition, violence, and psychological stress ensured that few survived into what we now consider middle age. Life was relentless, unprotected, and brutal. Yet through this crucible, some children survived, emerging into adolescence and adulthood, physically worn, mentally hardened, and only slightly lucky to continue the fight for survival. Reaching 40 was rare, and those who did were extraordinary, not in talent, but in endurance, constitution, and fortuitous circumstance. The story of medieval childhood is the story of human resilience against relentless pressure. It sets the foundation for understanding why life expectancy was so short, and why every adult who reached 40 carried the weight of decades of struggle. Beginning from the earliest moments of life, adolescence in the Middle Ages was far from a carefree period of learning and growth. By the time a child reached their teenage years, the harsh realities of medieval life had already shaped their body, mind, and expectations. Adolescents were not simply growing into adulthood, they were actively participating in survival, shouldering responsibilities that would challenge even the strongest adults today. Every day carried potential dangers, and every task contributed to the slow wearing down of the body that made life past 40 rare. From the onset of adolescence, labor intensified. Boys were expected to master the physical tasks of men: plowing, harvesting, chopping wood, tending livestock, and repairing homes. Each task required endurance, strength, and precision. Mistakes could result in injury, sometimes permanent, sometimes fatal. Girls, on the other hand, were expected to refine domestic skills while continuing to assist in agricultural labor. Cooking over open fires, carrying heavy water buckets, weaving, spinning, and tending to siblings or animals became daily responsibilities. Physical labor was relentless and unrelenting, leaving little time for rest or play. Nutrition remained inconsistent. Adolescence required more calories to support growth and labor, yet diets were meager. Bread, thin porridge, occasional vegetables, and sometimes meat formed their sustenance. Seasonal famine, crop failure, or poor harvest could leave adolescents malnourished, with stunted growth, weakened muscles, and compromised immunity. Their bodies were constantly under strain, struggling to adapt to the demands of physical development and relentless labor. Disease continued to claim its share of lives. Adolescents faced exposure to contagious illnesses like smallpox, measles, tuberculosis, and influenza. Living in crowded quarters with families, animals, and neighbors meant that infections spread easily. Parasites and worms were constant companions, quietly draining strength over weeks and months. Chronic illness was common. Even mild disease could leave lasting consequences: weakened bones, fatigued muscles, and compromised internal organs. Those who survived these illnesses carried the scars and weaknesses into adulthood, setting the stage for shortened life expectancy. Childbirth for girls became a looming danger. Girls married young, often in their mid-teens, and pregnancy became almost inevitable. Each pregnancy was a drain on the body, depleting iron, calcium, and energy reserves. The dangers of labor, hemorrhage, obstructed birth, infection were very real. Maternal mortality was high, and infant survival was never guaranteed. For girls entering adolescence, the awareness of these dangers was part of daily life, shaping both behavior and mental stress. Mental strain intensified during these years. Adolescents were acutely aware of mortality. Siblings or peers had already died, neighbors were sick, and famine or violence could strike unpredictably. Fear became a constant companion. Stress hormones circulated continuously, weakening the immune system, and accelerating the physical toll of labor and malnutrition. Adolescents learned to balance endurance with caution, to read signs of danger, and to respond quickly to threats. These skills were learned early and often under duress, shaping the psychological resilience necessary for survival. Injury was common. The combination of labor, handling animals, using heavy or sharp tools, and living in hazardous environments meant that scrapes, cuts, broken bones, and burns were routine. Without modern medicine, even minor wounds could become infected, leaving permanent disability or causing death. Adolescents were learning survival, but the lessons were often taught at a steep cost to the body. Each injury accelerated aging, weakening muscles, joints, and bones, and adding to the cumulative damage that reduced life expectancy. Education was practical and survival-oriented. Boys learned trades, farming techniques, animal husbandry, and basic defense skills. Girls learned domestic management, food preparation, weaving, and childcare. Literacy was rare except among the elite, and formal schooling was limited. Knowledge was valuable when it directly contributed to survival. Adolescents had to master these skills while also contributing labor daily. Their education was measured not in years spent in classrooms, but in their ability to keep themselves and their families alive. Social dynamics played a significant role in survival. Adolescents were integrated into adult society quickly. They witnessed social hierarchies, labor expectations, and the consequences of disobedience or negligence. Understanding one's place in the social structure, obeying authority, and navigating relationships with peers and elders were as important as physical labor. Mistakes could lead to punishment, injury, or exclusion, which could in turn increase vulnerability to hunger, illness, or violence. Food scarcity, illness, labor, and stress intercepted to shape physical development dramatically. Adolescents who survived were often stronger than children, but their bodies were already beginning to show signs of wear. Joints stiffened, spines bent, and muscles bore the permanent effects of labor. Stunted growth, chronic weakness, and early fatigue were common. By the end of adolescence, most bodies carried decades of accumulated strain, even before reaching full adulthood. Fear of mortality shaped every decision. Adolescents were aware that accidents, disease, and violence were constant threats. They learned to navigate danger carefully, often avoiding unnecessary risk when possible. Yet some risk was unavoidable, and survival depended on quick thinking, physical capability, and sometimes luck. Mental stress compounded the physical toll, further reducing long-term life expectancy. For many, adolescence included exposure to violence beyond accidents. Feuds between families, raids, and banditry were ongoing threats. Men entering early adulthood were expected to defend property or participate in local conflicts. Boys learned the use of weapons not for sport but for survival. Even girls were vulnerable to assault or exploitation. Exposure to violence reinforced the constant awareness of death as a near, ever-present reality. Religious belief shaped behavior and understanding of danger. Adolescents were taught that illness, misfortune, and death could be a form of divine punishment, or test. Prayer, rituals, and religious observance were woven into daily life as methods of coping with uncertainty and fear. While these practices provided emotional comfort, they did not mitigate the very real threats of disease, famine, and injury. Adolescents learned that survival required both physical skill and mental fortitude. By the end of adolescence, the majority of individuals had experienced repeated challenges that would define their adult lives. Labor had hardened the body but also created wear and tear that would shorten life. Disease had weakened the immune system. Malnutrition left permanent marks on growth and energy reserves. Mental stress and exposure to violence accelerated aging. For those who survived, adolescence was a period of intense preparation for adult life, but one that came at enormous physical and psychological cost. The cumulative effect of adolescence in the Middle Ages was profound. Bodies were already compromised, minds were hardened by constant exposure to fear, and life had been a continuous negotiation with danger. Survival into adulthood was a fragile achievement. Many who reached their late teens would not live past 30. And even those who survived into their 30s were already carrying the invisible toll of decades of labor, illness, and stress. Reaching 40 remained a rare and remarkable accomplishment. In essence, adolescence is not simply a bridge to adulthood. It was a crucible. The human body and mind were tested against the relentless pressures of a medieval world. Survival depended on physical strength, mental resilience, adaptability, knowledge, and the unpredictable force of luck. Those who endured carried the scars and lessons of these formative years, prepared to face the challenges of adult labor, childbirth, and societal expectations. Life expectancy was already being written in the bodies of adolescents, long before they reached adulthood. The story of adolescence in the Middle Ages reveals why life was so precarious. It explains how survival past 40 was unusual, why early death was the norm, and how the combination of labor, disease, malnutrition, stress, and danger shaped every life from its earliest moments. Understanding these formative years gives context to the harsh realities faced by adults, and the remarkable resilience required to reach middle age in a time when every year lived was a victory. Adulthood in the Middle Ages was a period of relentless labor, constant risk, and fragile survival. By the time individuals left adolescence behind, their bodies were already shaped by years of malnutrition, disease, and early physical strain. Adulthood did not bring relief. Instead, it brought increased responsibilities, heavier workloads, and new threats that together ensured that life expectancy remained perilously short. Every day was a negotiation with danger. And every year brought its own toll on the body and mind. Labor defined adult life. For men, physical work intensified, often involving plowing fields, harvesting crops, constructing buildings, hauling stone, or working in mines. These tasks were not occasional or mild, they demanded hours of repetitive, heavy activity, year-round, often beginning before sunrise and continuing until dusk. Mistakes could lead to serious injury. Even minor injuries often became infected, as antiseptics and sterilization were unknown. Broken bones, deep cuts, and crushed fingers were common and frequently permanent, leaving individuals weakened for the rest of their lives. Women faced a dual burden. They continued domestic labor, cooking, cleaning, washing clothes, fetching water, while simultaneously contributing to agricultural labor or tending animals. On top of these tasks came childbearing, often beginning in the teenage years and continuing into the 30s or even 40s. Each pregnancy depleted vital nutrients like iron, calcium, and protein. Labor was dangerous. Hemorrhage, infection, and obstructed delivery were common, and infant mortality was high. Many women died giving birth, while survivors were left chronically weakened, their bodies carrying the cumulative toll of multiple pregnancies, labor, and daily work. Nutrition remained precarious. Even adults who survived childhood often faced limited diets. Bread and porridge were staples, supplemented by vegetables, legumes, and the occasional meat or fish. Malnutrition was endemic, especially among the poor. Seasonal hunger and food shortages were regular threats. Chronic undernutrition weakened the immune system, slowed recovery from illness and injury, and accelerated the visible signs of aging. Fatigue became a permanent companion, even for those who were otherwise healthy. Disease continued to ravage adult populations. Infections, parasites, and contagious diseases spread rapidly in crowded homes and villages. Epidemics struck periodically, from influenza and smallpox to typhus and, eventually, the Black Death. Adults faced repeated bouts of illness throughout their lives, and even those who survived were left weakened. Chronic infections, anemia from parasites, and other lingering effects made bodies more fragile and less capable of enduring labor, childbirth, or further disease. Water and hygiene remained ongoing hazards. Wells, rivers and streams, the primary water sources, were often contaminated. Bathing was infrequent, soap was scarce, and homes were crowded with people and animals. Fleas, lice, and parasites were ever present. Even the wealthy were not entirely immune. Although manors and castles offered slightly better conditions, the risk of disease was never eliminated. Every adult carried the hidden burden of exposure, which manifested gradually as weakness, infection, and premature aging. Injury was a constant threat. Adults worked with heavy tools, handled dangerous animals, and navigated poorly maintained roads and structures. Accidents, falls, crushes, burns, and cuts were common and often fatal due to infection. Even minor injuries slowed labor and drained energy, adding to the cumulative toll on the body. Those who survived carried permanent disabilities, joint problems, or scars, each marking the physical cost of survival in a dangerous world. Violence remained pervasive. Wars, raids, and banditry threatened towns and rural areas alike. Men could be conscripted or expected to defend their villages. Property disputes, feuds, and personal conflicts often escalated into physical confrontations. Women faced violence as well, from domestic abuse to assault. Survival depended on both physical strength and social navigation, and luck played an undeniable role in avoiding fatal encounters. Mental stress continued to shape adult life. Adults lived in constant awareness of mortality, scarcity, and danger. Fear of disease, famine, accident, or violence produced chronic stress, which weakened immunity and accelerated aging. Adults were responsible for the survival of their families. They worried about children, spouses, aging parents, food stores, and future harvests. Psychological strain was relentless, and like physical labor, it accumulated over time, leaving deep scars that contributed to early mortality. Social class determined how much adults suffered, but it did not guarantee survival. Wealthier adults enjoyed better nutrition, safer living conditions, and access to rudimentary medical care. Castles and manors provided shelter, stored food, and protection from many environmental hazards. Physicians and herbalists offered treatment for illness, though their knowledge was imperfect. Even so, disease, childbirth, and accidents did not spare the wealthy entirely. Among the poor, survival was largely dependent on endurance, physical resilience, and fortune. The disparity created an invisible ladder of life expectancy, where wealth and status postponed death, but rarely eliminated risk entirely. Reproduction further defined adult survival. Adults were expected to marry and have children. Fertility brought additional risks, particularly for women. Men, while not endangered by childbirth, faced the responsibility of labor, protection, and resource management to support their families. Adults navigated these expectations while managing their own survival. Each pregnancy, each child, each year of labor added cumulative strain to an already taxed body. Environmental hazards were omnipresent. Homes were poorly insulated and exposed to cold, rain and snow. Fires used for cooking or heating were dangerous, with accidental burns or fatalities common. Storms and floods could destroy crops, homes or entire villages. Adults contended with both natural and man-made threats, each of which could shorten life or permanently weaken the body. Disease, malnutrition, labor, childbirth, violence, stress, and environmental hazards intersected to create a life of cumulative damage. Each year of adulthood added to the invisible debt carried by the body. By the time individuals reached their 30s or 40s, they often displayed the signs of toil: chronic pain, stunted growth, weakened muscles, worn joints, and premature aging. Death was constant, expected, and rarely far away. Yet despite these harsh realities, some adults survived. Those who did were often the strongest physically, mentally adaptable, and sometimes fortunate. Resilience, skill, and luck combined to create the rare medieval adult who reached or surpassed the age of 40. Even then, survival was not equivalent to modern notions of health. Adults were physically worn, psychologically hardened, and chronically burdened. Their existence was a testament to human endurance against relentless pressures. In adulthood, the cumulative effects of childhood and adolescence became fully apparent. Labor, malnutrition, disease, injury, and mental stress combined to accelerate aging. Survival was fragile and life expectancy remained short. Middle age was an achievement, not a given. Every year lived was a victory against forces beyond control. Adults who reached 40 were exceptional not because they escaped hardship, but because they endured it. The story of adulthood in the Middle Ages illustrates the interconnectedness of labor, disease, nutrition, mental stress, social inequality, and environmental hazard in determining life expectancy. Every challenge compounded the last, creating a world in which few live long enough to enjoy the wisdom, leisure, or comfort that modern adulthood allows. Life past 40 was rare, hard-earned, and remarkable. Adult life was both a crucible and a testament to resilience, shaping the human body and mind in ways that would define survival or death in the harsh medieval world. Life in the Middle Ages was a relentless balancing act between survival and exhaustion. And adulthood was the stage where the cumulative weight of childhood, adolescence, and constant labor became fully visible. By the age of 25 or 30, most individuals already bore the physical scars of years of toil, malnutrition, and disease. Every task, every meal, every illness, and every encounter with danger had slowly shaped the body, often leaving it vulnerable to decline. Survival into the 40s was a remarkable achievement, yet the daily realities of medieval life ensured that this milestone was rare and hard-won. Labor defined adult existence. Fields required constant tending, plowing, sowing, weeding and harvesting. Tools were crude, heavy and unforgiving. Men carried the burden of clearing forests, moving stones, and constructing houses, churches, and fortifications. Their muscles developed, but bones and joints were worn down early. Chronic back pain, arthritis, and limited mobility were common even in the prime of life. Injuries were routine. A fall from a cart, a misstep while wielding an axe, or a crush from a collapsed structure could permanently disable a worker. With medical knowledge limited, even minor wounds could become life-threatening infections. Women faced a dual challenge. Domestic labor, cooking over open fires, washing clothes by hand, tending the home, was physically demanding, but it was only part of the daily workload. Many women were also responsible for fieldwork, tending gardens, carrying water, and assisting in harvesting. Childbearing added a profound physical and emotional toll. Repeated pregnancies depleted vital nutrients. While childbirth itself was a leading cause of death, surviving each delivery required extraordinary resilience. Women who endured multiple pregnancies, and survived both childbirth and disease were rare, their bodies carrying the cumulative weight of labor and fertility into middle age. Nutrition remained inconsistent, and famine was an ever-present threat. Diets consisted primarily of coarse bread, porridge, and vegetables, with meat appearing only occasionally. Poor families faced scarcity frequently. Even the well-off could experience shortage during harsh seasons or political turmoil. Chronic malnutrition left individuals vulnerable to illness, fatigue, and early aging. Energy reserves were low, recovery from labor and injury was slow, and the immune system was weakened, creating a cycle where survival demanded constant adaptation and effort. Disease continued to shape life. Adults faced tuberculosis, leprosy, smallpox, dysentery, influenza, and countless other infections. Epidemics could sweep through entire villages in weeks, leaving survivors weakened and grieving. Chronic infection sapped strength slowly. Parasites and worms drained nutrients over months and years, silently contributing to malnutrition and premature aging. Those who survived repeated illnesses were stronger in resilience, but physically worn, their bodies bearing the evidence of accumulated exposure. Water and hygiene presented daily dangers. Wells and streams were often contaminated with human and animal waste, carrying pathogens invisible to the eye. Bathing was infrequent, and clothing or bedding could harbor lice and fleas. Even the wealthy were not fully insulated from these hazards. Adults carried the invisible burden of exposure, with infections often compounding over time to leave long-term effects on health. Injury remained a constant threat. Tools, animals, fire, and even daily travel posed risks. Cuts, bruises, burns, and fractures were common, and medical treatment was limited and often dangerous. Amputations, cauterization, or herbal remedies were applied inconsistently, sometimes worsening the condition. Each injury, no matter how small, added cumulative strain to the body. Adults frequently endured chronic pain, limited mobility, and scars that testified to years of hardship. Violence permeated medieval life. Wars, raids, and bandit attacks endangered men and women alike. Conscription into armies or militias meant exposure to battle. Local feuds could escalate to deadly encounters. Women were vulnerable to domestic abuse and assault. Survival depended not only on strength but on vigilance, social connections, and sometimes sheer luck. Mental stress accompanied the physical danger. Adults lived with constant awareness that death could strike at any moment. Mental strain played a critical role in life expectancy. Adults were responsible not only for their own survival but for their families. Anxiety over food, health, shelter, and safety generated chronic stress, which weakened the immune system and accelerated physical decline. Fear was a constant companion, and the mind learned early to anticipate danger. Adults had to manage labor, illness, social conflict, and environmental threats while navigating the unknowns of daily existence. The cumulative effect of mental stress manifested physically fatigue, weakened resistance to disease, and accelerated aging. Social status influenced survival, but it did not guarantee it. Wealthy adults enjoyed slightly better nutrition, cleaner living conditions, and access to rudimentary medical care. Castles, manors, and walled towns provided protection from some environmental hazards. Physicians or herbalists offered treatments, though these were limited and often ineffective. The poor, in contrast, relied largely on endurance, adaptability, and community support to survive. Even wealth could not prevent death from epidemic disease, accident, or childbirth. Life expectancy differences existed, but danger was never eliminated for anyone. Reproduction continued to shape adult mortality. Men were responsible for providing food security, and labor to support their families. Women endured pregnancy, childbirth, and childrearing while continuing their daily labor. Each pregnancy and each birth carried risk of death or chronic disability. Child mortality added emotional strain. Adults navigated these challenges, while still facing all the other hazards of medieval life, leaving few untouched by the relentless pressures of survival. Environmental factors further compounded the challenges. Homes were poorly insulated, exposing adults to cold, heat, and rain. Fires used for cooking or warmth caused burns and accidental deaths. Floods, storms, and natural disasters destroyed crops, homes, and infrastructure. Adults had to respond quickly, adapt to changing conditions, and repair damage, all while maintaining their health and labor output. Every season introduced new threats to survival. Cumulative effects of labor, disease, malnutrition, childbirth, injury, mental stress, and environmental hazard shaped adults profoundly. Bodies bore scars, chronic pain, and weakness. Immune systems were compromised. Growth and strength had been stunted since childhood. Fatigue was constant. By the time adults reached 30 or 40, their bodies were aged far beyond the calendar, and death was a frequent and ever-present possibility. Yet, despite these challenges, survival into middle age was achieved by some. Those who reached 40 or beyond were physically resilient, mentally adaptive, and occasionally blessed with fortune. Longevity was rare. But it offered testimony to the strength of the human body and mind under extraordinary pressure. Survival was a complex interplay of genetics, endurance, knowledge, and circumstance. Adults who achieved it carried lessons, scars, and memories of decades of relentless struggle. Life in adulthood, more than any other stage, revealed why medieval life expectancy was so short. Survival was never guaranteed, each year was one through continuous labor, vigilance, and resilience. Aging began early. Accelerated by decades of cumulative strain. The human body, shaped by hardship from birth through adolescence, faced the full force of medieval challenges in adulthood. Death could come at any moment, yet those who survived demonstrated extraordinary endurance. In conclusion, adulthood in the Middle Ages was a crucible. It revealed the full cost of survival: physical wear, mental strain, vulnerability, and constant exposure to risk. Life expectancy was defined not by possibility but by endurance. Each adult who reached 40 carried decades of evidence: scars, chronic disease, fatigue, and hardened resolve. The story of adult life explains why longevity was rare, mortality was omnipresent, and survival was an achievement remarkable for its resilience, adaptability, and sheer fortuitous circumstance. By the time people reached their 30s in the Middle Ages, life had already tested them relentlessly. Every scar, every illness, every injury was a record of survival, a silent chronicle of the dangers they had endured. Yet the 30s were not a reprieve. They were a period in which the cumulative weight of childhood, adolescence, and early adulthood became increasingly visible, and the constant pressures of labor, disease, malnutrition, childbirth, and stress continued unabated. The human body, already worn and resilient, was now facing the compounded challenges of survival in a world without modern medicine or comfort. Physical labor reached its peak intensity during this stage of life. Men carried the heaviest burdens, engaging in construction, plowing, harvesting, and repair work. The tools were crude, heavy, and unforgiving, requiring precision and strength. Mistakes could lead to serious injury, infection, or permanent disability. Even minor injuries became dangerous because medical care was limited and often harmful. A broken bone could leave a person weakened for life. A deep cut could turn fatal. Repeated stress on muscles and joints resulted in chronic pain, early arthritis, and limited mobility. Those who survived carried the evidence of these years visibly in their posture, gait, and physical endurance. Women in their 30s faced perhaps even greater strain. They continued domestic labor while managing agricultural work, animal husbandry, and childcare. Multiple pregnancies compounded the physical demands. Each birth drained vital nutrients, and childbirth itself was a leading cause of death. Women who survived labor bore the lifelong effects of repeated pregnancies. Weakened bones, chronic fatigue, reproductive complications, and a body slowly eroded by decades of work. Even daily household tasks, cooking over open fires, carrying water, grinding grain, added to cumulative physical strain, leaving women with permanent reminders of years of endurance. Nutrition remained precarious. Diets were based on bread, porridge, and vegetables, with meat or dairy appearing only occasionally. Seasonal famine, poor harvests or political instability often meant periods of hunger. Malnutrition weakened the immune system, slowed recovery from injuries and illness, and accelerated the visible effects of aging. Adults in their 30s were often chronically fatigued, carrying both the physical and metabolic consequences of decades of limited nutrition. Fatigue compounded the effects of labor, leaving little energy for recovery or leisure. Disease was relentless. Adults in their 30s faced repeated infections: smallpox, measles, dysentery, tuberculosis, and influenza, among others. Epidemics could sweep through villages in weeks, killing indiscriminately and leaving survivors weakened. Parasites, worms, and other hidden infections slowly drained strength, contributing to long-term malnutrition and chronic illness. Even those who survived repeated bouts of disease carried the lingering effects: weakened organs, scar tissue, anemia, and increased susceptibility to future illness. Disease was a silent, invisible force shaping life expectancy more than any single act of labor or violence. Water and hygiene continued to pose threats. Wells, rivers, and streams were contaminated with waste, and bathing was infrequent. Clothes and bedding harbored lice, fleas, and parasites. Houses were crowded, poorly ventilated, and often shared with animals. The accumulation of exposure over decades left adults with weakened defenses, chronic skin conditions, and vulnerability to infection. Even small cuts or burns could become dangerous. The relentless pressure of unsanitary conditions accelerated aging and diminished resilience. Injury remained a constant companion. Heavy tools, animals, fires, and travel posed daily hazards. Cuts, bruises, burns, and fractures were common. Infections from untreated wounds could become fatal. Adults carried these injuries forward, often developing chronic pain, limited mobility, or permanent disability. The physical cost of survival was etched into every joint, muscle, and bone. By their 30s, individuals already bore decades of accumulated damage, further reducing life expectancy. Violence continued to shape life. Local feuds, raids, and wars threatened both men and women. Men were expected to participate in combat, defend property, or protect villages, while women faced vulnerability to assault or domestic abuse. Social status could mitigate some dangers but not all. The poor faced daily exposure to violence, while the wealthy were not immune from epidemic injury, or battlefield death. Survival required strength, vigilance, and sometimes sheer luck. Each encounter with violence further aged the body and mind, adding to the cumulative toll of life. Mental stress intensified in the 30s. Adults bore responsibility for family survival, including food, shelter, protection, and childcare. Fear of disease, famine, accident, or conflict created chronic stress, which weakened immunity and accelerated aging. Psychological resilience became as critical as physical strength. Adults learned to balance fear with action, adaptability with caution, and endurance with prudence. The mental burden compounded over decades, leaving invisible scars that manifested physically: fatigue, illness susceptibility, and premature aging. Reproduction continued to dominate life, especially for women. Multiple pregnancies, childbirth, and child rearing were constant demands. Infant and maternal mortality rates remained high. Women who survived these challenges carried the long-term consequences of repeated pregnancies, including chronic pain, reproductive complications, and nutrient depletion. Men, while less directly endangered by childbirth, faced the continuous pressure of providing labor, protection, and resources for their families. reproductive responsibilities intertwined with labor and survival, further shaping life expectancy. Environmental hazards remained ever present. Homes offered limited protection from the cold, heat, and storms. Fires used for cooking or heating caused burns, while flooding or storms could destroy crops and property. Natural disasters threatened both life and livelihood. Adults navigated these environmental pressures while managing labor, illness, and social obligations. Each hazard added cumulative strain to bodies already worn by decades of hardship. Cumulative wear and tear from labor, disease, malnutrition, childbirth, injury, stress, and environmental hazards became fully visible in the 30s. Adults were often chronically fatigued, weak, and in pain. Joints and bones bore scars of repetitive labor and injury. Immune systems were compromised, organs weakened. Even those who survived were physically worn far beyond their chronological age. The calendar said 30, 5 or 38, but the body might have felt 50 or 60. Life expectancy remained uncertain, and the specter of death was never far away. Yet, despite these pressures, some adults persisted. Survival into the 40s was an extraordinary achievement, the result of resilience, adaptability, and often good fortune. Genetics, skill, and community support played roles, as did access to better nutrition or safer living conditions. Those who reached middle age were exceptional not because they were free from hardship, but because they had endured it continuously and survived. Adulthood in the 30s illustrates the cumulative nature of medieval life expectancy. Each year of labor, illness, childbirth, stress, and environmental exposure added to the invisible debt carried by the body. Life expectancy was rarely a matter of choice or planning. It was the product of endurance against relentless forces. Adults who reached their 40s were living testaments to survival, resilience, and the human capacity to withstand decades of hardship. In conclusion, the 30s were a crucible of adult life. The body bore the visible effects of decades of labor, disease, malnutrition, injury, and stress. Survival required constant vigilance, mental resilience, physical strength, and sometimes luck. Life expectancy remained precariously low, and reaching 40 remained a rare and remarkable accomplishment. Adults in this stage carried scars, chronic fatigue, and weakened bodies, yet their existence demonstrated the extraordinary endurance of human beings in a world of relentless pressure and danger. By the time people reached their 40s in the Middle Ages, life had already left an indelible mark on the body, mind, and spirit. Every scar, every chronic ache, every lingering weakness was a testament to decades of survival in a world where death was an ever-present companion. Reaching 40 was no small achievement, it was rare, remarkable, and earned only through resilience, adaptability, and a measure of luck. Those who survived this long carried with them the cumulative consequences of childhood deprivation, adolescent labor, adult hardship, disease, malnutrition, injury, and mental stress. Physical labor remained relentless, even as the body began to show signs of wear. Men continued the heavy tasks that had defined adulthood, plowing fields, hauling stone, constructing homes and fortifications, and maintaining roads or bridges. Muscles once strong and resilient, had become prone to fatigue and injury. Joints bore the brunt of decades of repetitive motion, developing chronic pain and stiffness. Arthritis, back pain, and limited mobility were common. But the work could not stop. The demands of survival required continuous effort regardless of the toll on the body. Women meanwhile faced a double burden. Household labor persisted alongside agricultural work and care for children. Multiple pregnancies had left lasting physical effects, weakened bones, fatigue, and reproductive complications were common. Even after childbearing years ended, the physical toll remained. Carrying water, tending gardens, preparing food over open fires, and performing endless cleaning maintained the relentless cycle of labor. Every task added to the accumulated strain, leaving women visibly aged beyond their years. Nutrition continued to influence life expectancy. Most diets consisted of bread, porridge and vegetables, with occasional meat or dairy. Malnutrition, exacerbated by seasonal shortages or famine, weakened the body further. Chronic deficiencies left adults vulnerable to disease, injury and fatigue. Those who survived into their 40s often did so despite years of inadequate nutrition, demonstrating resilience against conditions that would weaken or kill others. Food scarcity was a constant challenge, and its long-term effects were visible in stunted stature, frail muscles and worn joints. Disease remained an omnipresent threat. Smallpox, tuberculosis, dysentery, leprosy, influenza, and other infectious diseases continued to claim lives. Adults in their 40s had faced repeated exposures throughout life, and their immune systems were often compromised from decades of strain. Epidemics could decimate entire communities, sparing only a few survivors. Parasites, worms and lingering infections drained energy silently, contributing to malnutrition and chronic weakness. Even minor illnesses carried disproportionate risk. Survival was contingent on constitution previous exposures, and the ability to endure repeated physical and psychological assaults. Water and hygiene remained critical hazards. Wells, rivers and streams were often contaminated. Bathing was infrequent, clothing and bedding were infested with lice or fleas, and homes were crowded and unsanitary. The accumulated exposure over decades contributed to skin conditions, infections, and general decline in health. Even adults with better living conditions could not entirely escape these threats. The invisible enemies of contamination compounded the visible scars of labor and disease, shaping the trajectory of every adult's health and longevity. Injury continued to be a significant threat. Adults had spent decades working with heavy tools, managing livestock, navigating hazardous terrain, and tending fires. Cuts, burns, fractures, and crush injuries were routine, and medical care was rudimentary. Infections from untreated injuries could become fatal. By their 40s, most adults carried the consequences of repeated injuries: stiff joints, chronic pain, limited mobility and scars that testified to the cost of survival. Even minor accidents could have cascading consequences, further reducing life expectancy. Violence remained a constant risk. Local feuds, raids, warfare, and bandit attacks threatened communities, and individuals were vulnerable at every stage. Men were expected to participate in defense or combat, often without formal training or protection. Women were at risk of assault, exploitation, or domestic violence. Survival depended on vigilance, strength, adaptability, and social alliances. Those who reached E40 had typically navigated countless dangerous situations, relying on skill, awareness, and luck to survive. Mental stress was compounded by decades of responsibility. Adults were accountable not only for their own survival, but for the well-being of family, children, and sometimes aging parents. Fear of disease, famine, accident, and violence persisted. Chronic stress weakened immune function, exacerbated fatigue, and accelerated the visible signs of aging. Mental resilience became as critical as physical endurance. Adults learned to anticipate danger, manage resources, and make decisions under constant pressure. Those who survived their 40s had mastered an ongoing balancing act of vigilance, decision-making and emotional fortitude. Reproduction had left enduring effects. Women's bodies bore the scars of multiple pregnancies and childbirths, while men continued to carry the burden of providing labor, security, and resources. Infant and maternal mortality rates remained high, and the emotional toll of losing children compounded physical strain. By 40, adults had witnessed death repeatedly. Siblings, neighbors, or children, and this awareness shaped both behavior and psychological resilience. Survival in middle age required constant adaptation to the pressures of family, labor, and health. Environmental hazards continued to take their toll. Homes provided limited protection from the elements. Fire, storms, floods, and extreme weather posed continuous risk. Adults were responsible for repairing damage, safeguarding property, and ensuring the survival of their families, often at great personal risk. exposure to cold, heat, moisture, and other environmental stressors compounded the effects of disease, labor, and malnutrition. Life in the 40s was a continuous negotiation with forces beyond control. The cumulative effects of decades of labor, disease, malnutrition, injury, mental stress, and environmental pressure became fully apparent in middle age. Adults bore visible signs of aging far beyond their chronological years. Chronic pain, fatigue, weakened immunity, and organ decline were common. Life expectancy remained precariously low. Reaching 40 was exceptional. Those who did were often the strongest, most resilient, or luckiest individuals in their community. Longevity was not guaranteed, it was earned through endurance, adaptation, and the capacity to survive repeated, relentless challenges. Yet, adults in their 40s represented the extraordinary potential of human resilience. They carried the accumulated knowledge of decades, navigating labor, illness, childbirth, social structures, and environmental hazards with experience and skill. Survival past 40 was both a testament to physical endurance and a reflection of the human capacity to adapt psychologically and socially. These individuals had endured a lifetime of challenges invisible to the modern eye: constant exposure to pathogens, unrelenting labor, poor nutrition, social and environmental hazards, and repeated encounters with mortality. In essence, life in the 40s was a crucible of endurance. Adults bore the consequences of decades of hardship, demonstrating remarkable resilience in the face of near-constant danger. Their physical and psychological state reflected the cumulative pressures of medieval existence. Those who survived their 40s were rare. Extraordinary examples of human survival in a time when life was short, fragile, and unforgiving. Life expectancy era was defined by endurance, adaptation, and the ability to survive invisible and visible threats for decades. The story of adults in their 40s explains why so few people live long lives in the Middle Ages. It reveals how survival depended on constant labor, resilience, skill, and luck, and why reaching 40 was a milestone few could claim. These individuals carried the visible and invisible marks of a life lived under relentless pressure. Their existence a testament to the extraordinary capacity of humans to endure, adapt, and persist even in the harshest of circumstances. By the time adults reached their late 40s, the human body in the Middle Ages had endured decades of relentless labor, repeated illness, malnutrition, injury, and psychological stress. Few survived this long, and those who did carried visible and invisible signs of a life spent constantly negotiating survival. Every scar, every ache, every weakened joint told a story of endurance against the unrelenting pressures of medieval existence. Life in the 40s was not a period of ease, it was a continuation of hardship, where each day demanded resilience, vigilance, and adaptation. Physical labor remained unavoidable. Men continued to bear the heaviest workloads: plowing, hauling, harvesting, and constructing buildings or fortifications. Tools were crude and unforgiving, requiring precision, strength, and endurance. Repeated strain on muscles and joints had already resulted in chronic pain, stiffness, arthritis, and early mobility limitations. Even a minor misstep could result in injury or exacerbate existing conditions. Despite the visible wear on the body, the work had to continue, as survival depended on productivity and contribution to the household or community. Women in their 40s faced continued physical demands. Though childbirth might have become less frequent or ended entirely, household labor remained constant: cooking over open fires, washing and mending clothes, fetching water, and managing domestic responsibilities consumed daily energy. Agricultural work, caring for livestock, and tending gardens persisted alongside domestic duties. Years of repeated pregnancies, combined with physical labor, had left women chronically fatigued, weakened, and more vulnerable to disease. Their bodies bore the cumulative weight of decades of work, often leaving them visibly aged and physically diminished. Nutrition continued to be precarious. Diets were simple bread, porridge, seasonal vegetables, legumes, and the occasional meat or fish. Scarcity due to famine, crop failure, or political instability left adults vulnerable to malnutrition. Long-term deficiencies weakened bones, muscles, and immune systems, reducing resilience against disease and injury. Fatigue was constant, recovery from illness slow, and overall health compromised. Adults in their 40s had endured years of dietary limitations, and their physical capacity reflected the cumulative effects of decades of undernutrition. Disease remained a persistent threat. Smallpox, tuberculosis, dysentery, influenza, and other infectious diseases continued to claim lives. Epidemics could sweep through entire communities, leaving only the most resilient survivors. Parasites and chronic infections silently drained strength, compounded malnutrition, and accelerated aging. Those who survived were often physically compromised, carrying the invisible effects of repeated illness. Even minor infections could be dangerous. And the 40s were often marked by the lingering consequences of decades of exposure. Hygiene and sanitation remained significant hazards. Wells, rivers, and streams, the primary water sources, were frequently contaminated. Bathing was infrequent. Clothing and bedding often infested with lice or fleas, and homes were overcrowded and poorly ventilated. The cumulative effects of long-term exposure to pathogens contributed to chronic infections, weakened immunity, and visible signs of aging. Adults who survived into their 40s had endured years of environmental hazards that slowly eroded health, even without dramatic incidents of disease or injury. Injury continued to shape daily life. Working with heavy tools, tending animals, navigating uneven terrain, and cooking over open fires created constant risk. Cuts, burns, fractures, and crush injuries were routine. Without advanced medical treatment, even minor wounds could become infected, leading to chronic disability or death. By the 40s, most adults carried the physical consequences of decades of injuries: stiff joints, chronic pain, mobility limitations, and scars that testified to survival. Each injury further weakened the body, compounding the effects of disease, malnutrition, and labor. Violence remained an ever-present threat. Raids, local feuds, warfare, and social conflicts exposed adults to risk. Men were expected to defend property, participate in combat, or protect families. Women remained vulnerable to assault or domestic violence. Survival relied on a combination of physical strength, experience, vigilance, and luck. Adults in their 40s had likely survived numerous encounters with violence, which contributed both to physical deterioration and to psychological strain. Every confrontation carried the potential to be fatal, underscoring the fragility of life at this stage. Mental stress accumulated over decades. Adults were responsible not only for themselves but for families, households, and communities. Anxiety over food, health, labor, and safety was constant. Chronic stress weakened the immune system and exacerbated the physical effects of aging. Decision-making carried high stakes. One mistake could threaten survival or livelihood. Psychological resilience became for continued life, complementing physical endurance. Adults in their 40s had long developed coping strategies, balancing vigilance, labor, and emotional management in a world that offered little reprieve. Reproduction shaped life for both men and women. Women's bodies reflected the cumulative effects of childbirth and repeated pregnancies. Men continued the burdens of labor, protection, and providing for their families. Child mortality, maternal mortality, and the deaths of siblings or peers created ongoing emotional and practical challenges. By the 40s, adults had accumulated decades of experience managing these pressures while continuing to endure every other hazard of medieval life. Environmental factors added ongoing strain. Homes offered minimal protection from extreme weather. Fires used for cooking or heating created hazards, and floods, storms, or poor infrastructure could destroy crops, property, and homes. Adults were tasked with repair, protection, and adaptation, often while already weakened by decades of work. Disease and malnutrition. Life in the 40s demanded constant negotiation with these environmental pressures. By this stage, the cumulative effects of decades of labor, disease, malnutrition, injury, psychological stress, and environmental challenges were fully visible. Adults were chronically fatigued, weak, and in pain. Joints and muscles were worn down, bones weakened, and organs compromised. Survival beyond 40 was remarkable. Those who demonstrated extraordinary endurance, skill, and resilience. Life expectancy remained uncertain, as death could occur suddenly from disease, accident, or conflict. Yet the mere fact of surviving into the 40s represented a rare and remarkable triumph. Despite the physical and mental toll, adults in their 40s carried experience, knowledge, and wisdom. They had navigated decades of continuous threat and hardship, mastering labor, social structures, and survival strategies. Their resilience reflected both adaptation to extreme circumstances and a measure of fortune. Life expectancy in this era was largely determined by the ability to endure these pressures while avoiding fatal accidents or diseases. Adults in their 40s represented the extraordinary potential of human survival under relentless and unforgiving conditions. In conclusion, the 40s were a stage in which the cumulative consequences of medieval life became undeniable. Chronic fatigue, disease, injury, malnutrition, stress, and environmental challenges shaped the physical and mental state of adults. Reaching this age was rare, and those who survived embodied endurance and resilience. Life expectancy in the Middle Ages was defined not by potential, but by survival against constant threats. Adults in their 40s carried the evidence of decades of hardship, and their continued existence was a testament to the remarkable adaptability and strength of humans facing an unforgiving world. Infant mortality was the first and most relentless barrier. In towns and villages, a third or more of children died before reaching their first birthday. Birth itself was dangerous. Mothers and babies faced complications that modern medicine easily prevents, yet in medieval homes, these complications were often fatal. A lack of sterile conditions, minimal knowledge of anatomy, and the absence of effective medical intervention, meant that many children never had the chance to grow. Even when infants survived birth, they were not out of danger. Early childhood was filled with disease, malnutrition, and constant exposure to unsanitary conditions. Water, which should have been a source of life, often became a source of death. Wells, rivers, and streams, the primary sources of drinking water, were contaminated with human and animal waste. People could not see bacteria or parasites, so they trusted the water as safe. Yet each sip could carry unseen enemies. Dysentery, intestinal worms, cholera, like illnesses, or other infections that gradually weakened the body. Children, whose immune systems were fragile, were particularly vulnerable. Families learned to cope through observation rather than understanding, often relying on boiling water, when fuel was available, or drinking ale, which, because it was boiled, carried fewer pathogens. However, not all ale was safe, and drinking too much brought other health problems. Hygiene was rudimentary at best. People bathed infrequently, often only once a month or less. Bathhouses existed in some cities, but they were crowded and poorly maintained, which sometimes spread disease rather than preventing it. Clothing and bedding were washed rarely, if at all. Fleas, lice, and parasites thrived in the fabric of daily life, infesting bodies and homes alike. Even the wealthy, though insulated to some degree, faced exposure to these invisible dangers. Houses were crowded, and animals often shared living spaces with humans. Floors were covered in straw, dirt, and food scraps, creating fertile ground for disease. Nutrition was another invisible killer. Most medieval people were peasants who depended on grain, often in the form of bread or porridge, supplemented by vegetables and occasional meat. Hunger was a constant threat. Crop failures due to drought, flood, or disease could lead to famine. Malnutrition weakened bodies, making them more susceptible to infection, slower to heal, and less able to endure the rigors of daily life. Food scarcity was compounded by social class. The wealthy had access to better diets, while the poor had to survive on what they could grow or afford. Seasonal hunger was expected, and long-term starvation was common. Labor began early and never truly ended. Children were put to work almost immediately carrying water, tending animals or assisting in fields. By adolescence they faced back-breaking work that continued daily into adulthood. Men plowed fields, cut timber, hauled stone, and carried heavy loads for decades. Women worked equally hard, balancing household duties, agricultural labor, and childbirth. The human body, never designed for constant strain without relief, began to wear down early. By the time people reached 30 or 40, joints were stiff, muscles weakened, and chronic pain was the norm. Injuries were common and often permanent, as medical care and infections frequent. Disease was relentless. Epidemics swept through towns and countryside alike. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and later the Black Death claimed lives indiscriminately. People lived in constant proximity to the sick, and contagion spread quickly. Even minor illnesses that are easily treated today could become fatal due to malnutrition, exhaustion or secondary infections. The absence of vaccines and antibiotics meant that once infection began, it often ran its course unimpeded. Repeated bouts of disease left survivors weakened and aged prematurely. Childbirth was particularly dangerous for women. Mothers faced death from hemorrhage, infection, or obstructed labor. Many women gave birth multiple times, often with little recovery between pregnancies. Each pregnancy drained nutrients and strength, and repeated childbirth left women chronically weakened. Infant mortality added psychological stress and grief, compounding the physical toll. Even surviving childbirth did not guarantee long life. The cumulative effects of repeated pregnancies, labor, disease, and malnutrition made women especially vulnerable to dying in their 30s or 40s. Violence was another constant threat. Feuds, raids, wars, and banditry were common. Even outside times of open conflict, cities were crowded and dangerous. Knives and other weapons were part of daily life. Injuries, whether accidental or intentional, often became fatal due to infection. Legal and social systems offered little protection for the poor, who faced both economic and physical violence routinely. For men, conscription into armies meant exposure to battle injury and disease at a young age. For everyone, sudden death from violence was a real possibility. Fear and mental stress shaped survival as much as physical danger. Constant worry about food, water, disease, and family survival created chronic stress that weakened immune systems, disrupted sleep, and accelerated aging. Children grew up with anxiety as a normal part of life, and adults carried decades of stress in their bodies. Mental strain was invisible but lethal, compounding the physical challenges of labor, disease, and malnutrition. Sanitation, or the lack thereof, was a silent killer. Open sewers, contaminated wells, and the sharing of living space with animals ensured that pathogens were everywhere. Latrines were primitive and often leaked into drinking water. Streets carried human and animal waste, spreading infection. Even seemingly minor contact with contaminated surfaces could introduce life-threatening bacteria. Medical care was limited, and often harmful. Physicians relied on humoral theory, bloodletting, purges, and herbal remedies. Surgery was crude and performed without anesthesia or sterilization. While some treatments offered relief, many caused more harm than good, leaving patients weaker or accelerating death. Quackery and superstition further complicated survival. Even for those who survived early childhood, the constant combination of labor, disease, malnutrition, violence, stress, and poor hygiene meant that the human body aged rapidly. By 40, organs were weakened, joints stiffened, immunity diminished, and resilience exhausted. For most people, death was the inevitable outcome of a lifetime of cumulative hardships. Only a few, through a combination of luck, genetics, and circumstance, managed to surpass this fragile benchmark. The short life expectancy of the Middle Ages was not a result of a single cause. but of the relentless combination of multiple invisible and visible threats that touch every aspect of life. From birth to death, survival required endurance against forces that modern humans rarely encounter. Every day carried risk, every year added to the accumulated toll. Life was measured not just in years but in resilience, adaptation, and sheer luck. By understanding why most people did not live past 40, we gain insight into a world where death was a constant companion, labor was unending, disease was omnipresent, and survival was fragile. Medieval life was harsh, unrelenting, and unforgiving, and yet human beings endured, adapted, and sometimes, against all odds, survived. Their lives remind us that longevity is a gift earned through resilience, circumstance, and the endurance of countless unseen dangers,